king of Syria, or of Aram, sends horses and chariots to circle Dothan at night to take Elisha, the prophet, who had been giving information to the king of Israel regarding upcoming attacks and foiling their efforts. As a friend pointed out in a comment on our previous episode, Elisha didn't go looking for information as most spies would. He just listened and passed on what God shared with him. So maybe he wasn't a spy. Good point, and thank you, Bob. Now let's pick up the story from there. Hi, I'm Ken Goodevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Today we study 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 to 23. Elisha's servant gets up very early and sees the horses and chariots circling the city. Chuck Smith assumes that this was Gehazi still. Robert Jameson, on the other hand, believes that this was a new servant who had only been with him since Gehazi's dismissal and consequently had little or no experience of his master's powers. His faith was easily shaken by so unexpected an alarm as horses and chariots around his residence. And so he asked his master, "What shall we do?" And Elisha gives that famous response, "Don't worry, for those that are with us are more than those who are with them." Now this seems to be a reference to what Moses said to the Israelites fleeing Egypt and facing the Red Sea in front of them. In Exodus chapter 14, verse 13, he says, "Don't fear, stand by and see the salvation of the Lord." And in verse 14, he adds, "The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent." Don't fear, stand by, keep silent. I think Elisha was trying to get the same message across to his servants. And then we must also not neglect or downplay the beginning of verse 17 in our current passage. Then Elisha prayed. So don't fear, stand still, be silent, pray. Don't fear, stand still, be silent, pray. He prayed that God would open his servant's eyes that he may see what he was seeing. Well, for starters, we assume that Elijah was seeing something that the servant was not seeing at first, until the Lord opened his eyes. What did he see? Well, he saw the mountain was full of horses, not the city. The city was full of horses and chariots, but they were the enemy's horses. This was the mountain, was full of horses and chariots, and not ordinary chariots, but chariots of fire that were all around Elisha. In verse 15, we have Aram's army. In verse 17, we have God's army, the unseen reality. Robert Jameson quotes Keil, K-E-I-L, on the matter of God's spiritual army. He says, quote, "The horses and chariots were symbols of the divine power, and their fiery nature denoted their supernatural origin. For fire, the most ethereal of earthly elements, is the most appropriate symbol of the Godhead." Now, verses 18 onwards can be a little confusing. Let's see if we can figure them out. The army in verse 18 is Aram's army. Elisha prays that God would now strike them with blindness. Now, there are various notes here as to how this was done. One suggests through a blinding light, another through dazzling deception. Take your choice. In any case, God did what Elijah asked, and then Elisha convinced them into going a different way to Samaria to find the person they were looking for. Now, this was Elisha himself that they were looking for. So Jameson says this was not a total and material blindness, for then they could not have followed him, but a mental hallucination, so that they did not perceive or recognize him to be the object of their search. And he was going along with them, So he wasn't really lying. He was going to go along with them and lead them. And there they would find him when their eyes were cleared up again or their blindness taken away. This is also a reference back to Genesis 19, verse 11, where the men who were at the door of Lot's house in Sodom, you can look that story up, Genesis chapter 19, these guys are struck with blindness by the two angels who are visiting Lot. This blinding light prevents them from finding the door despite their attempt to enter Lot's house. For our current passage, David Gusick suggests Elijah was deceitful to a point. He led them to the king of Israel when they were looking for Elisha himself, although Gusick points out that Elijah went with them, as I mentioned earlier, and was technically in Samaria as well. Now, in Samaria, Elisha asked God to open their eyes again, and he did. And then the king of Israel, who was there, asked Elijah if he should strike them down. In fact, he now refers to Elisha as my father, according to the New American Standard Bible, or as the NAT says, my master. Imagine that. A guy that had no use for the prophet of God now refers to him as my father, my master. Elisha says, no, you didn't capture them, so what gives you the right to strike them down? Just give them food and water so they can return to their own master. And the king of Israel throws a big banquet for them. They eat and they drink, and they're sent back to their own king. And here's the wonderful conclusion of this strategy. It's at the end of verse 23. After that, no Syrian raiding parties ever again invaded the land of Israel. Let's dig deeper. Before we do, I just am reminded that this perhaps is the approach that the current president of the United States takes with many of his enemies. He gets them to the point where it's clear that he has defeated them, but he doesn't get rid of them. He gives them a chance to go back and live peacefully on the earth. I think that's interesting. David Gusick reminds us that, quote, the previous lack of perception on the part of Elisha's servant did not make the reality of the spiritual army any less real. And here comes a lesson for us. If there are 50 people who do not see something, it doesn't invalidate the perception of the one who does see it. End of quote. We also note the difference in the two armies. The Syrians had horses and chariots. God's army had chariots of fire. Big difference when you think about it. In verse 18, Elisha refers to Syrian horses and chariots as these people. And the NAT says this could easily be translated as this nation. So, God strike this nation, perhaps emphasizing the strength and size of the Syrian army. Other lessons from this passage? Well, I think there are a lot of them to note. For starters, we know that the enemy surrounds us at night to claim us. We need to live in the light and stay away from the darkness, the spiritual darkness. Secondly, let's not just focus on the physical things that we see, but let's search for the spiritual things on God's mountain. God's army in the mountain. Third, here's the attitude we need to adopt. Fear not, stand by, keep silent, pray. Fear not, stand by, keep silent, pray. That's so doable, my friends. Next time, we'll take a look at the siege that Samaria undergoes and what that ultimately causes. Join us for that. And in the meantime, if you like what you're hearing, if you like the way we do our studies, verse by verse, passage by passage, please like this video that you're watching. And furthermore, if you haven't done so already, thank you for those many that have, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, put in Digging for Scriptural Gems, and subscribe. It's as simple as that. And there's no cost. You'll just get notified when something new comes up. But above all, keep on studying God's Word.